What if humans weren't the first smart creatures the Sumerians wrote about? What if their oldest clay tablets talk about beings that don't look like anything alive today? Under the hot, sandy plains of southern Iraq, where wind shapes sand into slow-moving waves, pieces of baked clay sit in darkness. Each tablet was pressed by hands 5,000 years ago to save what must not be forgotten. But what they saved wasn't the story of how humans began. It was something that came before us. So before the silence gets deeper, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you're interested in histories that exist between what we can prove and what we've lost. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this question spreading across time zones, whispered in the dark. The story begins not with answers, but with clay that refused to wash away. In the 1840s and 1850s, European scientists dug into the ancient hills of Mesopotamia. They expected simple scratches, early tries at keeping records. Instead, they found something that shouldn't exist: a complete writing system. The Sumerians appeared in history around 3500 BC with cuneiform writing already finished. Wedge-shaped marks arranged in complex grammar that recorded not just grain counts and agreements, but astronomy, math, and temple ceremonies. Their cities, Uruk, Eridu, rose with perfect geometric planning. Their water systems stretched for miles. Their base 60 math system still controls our hours and minutes today. It was as if civilization didn't slowly develop. It simply arrived. Scholars have spent over a century trying to explain that suddenness. Civilizations are supposed to stumble forward. Rough tools becoming better ones. Simple shelters growing into planned cities. But the Sumerians break that pattern. Their language has no known relatives. Their cities show no slow development. And most disturbing of all, their earliest tablets don't begin with human kings or human achievements. They begin with descriptions of others. Imagine holding one of those tablets. Its surface still rough from ancient fingers. The wedge marks describe beings with wings, beings with scales, beings whose skin shone like copper, beings who came up from the waters of the Abzu, the deep waters under the earth. Some are called Anunnaki, some Apkallu, some simply those who came down from the sky. The Sumerians didn't write these as stories. They recorded them with the same care they used for grain storage and star positions, as if writing down real facts. One tablet lists 7 wise men, part fish and part human, who rose from the sea to teach people farming, writing, and laws. Another describes kings before the flood whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. Kings with names that appear nowhere else in human history. A third speaks of lesser gods who worked until they rebelled, then were replaced by a newly created species. Humans. The clay doesn't guess. It states facts. When scientists dug up Eridu, Sumer's oldest city according to their own king lists, they found 17 layers of temples built one on top of another. The deepest layers came before known human settlements. The foundations under Uruk's White Temple use building methods not found in later Sumerian buildings. At Kish, tools came from layers thousands of years older than the Sumerians themselves. Each dig showed the same pattern. Something was there before. Maybe that's why the Sumerians described creation not as a beginning, but as a replacement. In the Atrahasis story, humans are created only after an earlier species refuses to keep working. The god Enki suggests mixing clay with the blood of a killed god to make workers who won't rebel. The language is scientific, step by step, as if recording an engineering solution rather than a divine mystery. Some researchers say these are just mythological stories about social rankings. But mythology usually makes things simpler. These texts do the opposite. They give specific measurements, family trees, star positions. They tell the difference between human and non-human characters with scientific care. And they repeat the same disturbing claim across centuries. We came after. In the Louvre, a limestone carving shows a scene from 3000 BC. Figures with bird heads stand twice as tall as human attendants, holding tools whose purpose remains unclear. In the British Museum, cylinder seals show fish-human hybrids teaching kneeling humans. In Baghdad's Iraq Museum, before the 2003 looting, carvings displayed reptilian humanoids blessing Sumerian kings. These aren't random artistic choices. They appear consistently across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian culture, drawn with anatomical precision. Art historians note the body proportions suggest real biological models, not fantasy. The same beings appear in king lists, temple dedications, and government records. One Neo-Assyrian text describes restoring a temple according to the measurements left by those who came before the flood. Before, not a metaphor for ancient times, but a time marker. The flood itself appears in every Mesopotamian tradition: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. The story is always the same. An earlier world ends in water. Entire species vanish. Only pieces of knowledge survive, carried forward by a chosen few. When Sir Leonard Woolley dug in the 1920s, he found an 8-foot layer of water-deposited clay separating two different cultural periods. Below the flood layer, older artifacts, older foundations, older remains. Above it, the Sumerians rebuilding. But the tablets claim something more. They suggest the flood didn't just reset human history. It erased other kinds of history, species that walked, taught, ruled, and then disappeared, leaving only their words pressed into clay by the survivors who remembered them. At night, when museum halls empty and display lights dim, I think about those tablets resting in temperature-controlled darkness. Each one a piece of memory from beings who claimed they weren't the first. The Sumerians mapped Venus with accuracy we only confirmed with modern telescopes. They recorded precession cycles spanning 26,000 years. They inherited math so advanced it suggests not invention but transmission. Maybe that's what disturbs us most. Not that the Sumerians were advanced, but that they repeatedly insist they were taught by beings they describe with wings, scales, amphibious bodies, glowing skin. Beings whose physical forms don't match any species in our current fossil record. We call it mythology because the alternative breaks something fundamental. The belief that humans are history's first authors, not its inheritors. But the clay whispers a different story. One where we arrived late to a world already shaped by others. Where our first act of writing was an act of remembering, preserving the final traces of species that came before the flood, before the silence, before us. If the Sumerians weren't describing gods or symbols or metaphors, if they were documenting what they genuinely believed they'd inherited, then the question becomes unbearable. Who were these beings that ruled, taught, and vanished before humanity rose? And what remains of them beneath the sand? The wind moves differently over Uruk's ruins, not in gusts, but in long, patient breaths, as if the desert itself is breathing through thousands of years of collapsed walls and buried courtyards. During summer months, when temperatures climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the air shimmers above the tell mounds, blurring their edges until the ancient city seems to waver between solid and mirage. Local guides say the ruins are quietest at dawn, before the heat arrives, when shadows still cling to the broken ziggurats and the sand holds its shape. That's when the clay feels closest. Thousands of tablets remain scattered across southern Iraq. Some in museums, some in private collections, many still buried beneath farm fields and village homes. Each one a fragment of something larger. Each one pressed by hands that lived closer to the building of Stonehenge than to us. When archaeologists first dug up these tablets in the mid-1800s, they assumed they'd found humanity's first clumsy experiments with writing crude symbols, simple counting systems, the expected stumbling of early minds trying to grasp abstract ideas. Instead, they found sophistication that had no right to exist. The cuneiform script appeared fully realized, not as pictures slowly evolving into sound symbols, but as a complete grammar system capable of expressing abstract philosophy, legal subtlety, and mathematical calculation. The tablets documented star observations requiring centuries of continuous record-keeping. They described building plans using geometric principles that wouldn't be formally written down in the West for another 3,000 years. Temple orientations aligned with solstice positions. City grids followed celestial patterns. Henry Rawlinson, the British scholar who helped decode cuneiform in the 1850s, wrote to a colleague, "It is as though we have discovered a library without finding the schoolhouse where its authors learned to write. That absence haunts every discovery since. Because when you read the earliest datable tablets, those from the Uruk IV period around 3200 BC, you don't find humans learning. you find humans remembering. The difference is subtle but huge. Learning builds step by step, leaving traces of mistakes and corrections. Memory begins mid-sentence, referencing what came before as if the reader already knows. The Sumerian tablets begin mid-sentence. They reference the time before the flood without explaining what the flood was. They mention the 7 who descended without introducing them. They speak of Eridu, first of cities, as though its founding needs no context, as though everyone already understands that Eridu was built by Enki, who rose from the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth. But perhaps most disturbing, they describe these founding figures not as abstract concepts dwelling in some heavenly realm, but as physical beings with specific features. The Apkallu, those 7 wise men credited with bringing civilization to humanity, are depicted with fish scales covering their lower bodies and human torsos above. Temple hymns describe them as pure Paradu fish who came up from the sea. Not metaphorical fish, not symbols of wisdom. The texts specify they emerged from water, they walked on land, they taught farming and math, they left before the flood came. Other beings appear with equal specificity. The Anunnaki are described as tall with elongated skulls and skin that reflects light like polished copper. Several texts note they require the bread of life and the water of life to sustain themselves, provisions brought from the shining place above. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king describes meeting one of these beings. His body was covered with hair like that of the beast, yet he walked upright. His strength was as the strength of many men. Meanwhile, administrative tablets from the early dynastic period list offerings made to those who dwell in the Abzu, the underwater palace of Enki. The offerings include food, textiles, and crafted goods, suggesting the recipients were understood to have physical needs and physical presence. Archaeological evidence deepens the puzzle. Cylinder seals from the Uruk period, humanity's earliest identified artworks, consistently show the same imagery. Large figures with non-human features interacting with smaller human attendants. Bird-headed beings hold measuring rods and coiled ropes, tools associated with temple construction and land surveying. Fish-human hybrids stand before kneeling humans in postures of instruction. Beings with horned crowns and wings tower over agricultural scenes. These aren't occasional artistic flourishes. They appear on thousands of seals across 5 centuries, rendered with careful attention to anatomical detail, muscle structure, joint articulation, the precise positioning of wings or scales. Art historians call them composite beings, a term that describes form without explaining origin. Why would a civilization invest such effort in depicting beings they knew to be imaginary? Or did they know them to be imaginary? The Warka vase, discovered in Uruk and dating to approximately 3200 BC, shows a procession of offerings being presented to Inanna. The bottom register depicts grain and water, the foundation of life. The middle register shows animals and humans. The top register shows the goddess receiving tribute, flanked by 2 tall figures whose proportions don't match human anatomy. Their torsos are elongated, their limbs unusually thin, their heads distinctly non-human in shape. Museum placards call them attendant deities. But the Sumerians had a different term. They called them Dinger, the word we translate as God, but which literally means those who from the shining came. Not metaphysical beings, not conceptual forces. Those who came from where? The tablets repeat the phrase, from the sky or heavens, and from Abzu, the deep waters. 2 origins, 2 types of beings, both described as arriving before humans existed in their current form, both credited with shaping the world that humanity inherited. The question becomes unavoidable. If the Sumerians were simply inventing deities to explain natural phenomena, as scholars traditionally assume, why give them such specific biological and often non-divine characteristics? Why describe gods who eat, who sweat, who bleed when cut, who interbreed with humans and produce offspring? Why document their physical measurements, their clothing, their tools, unless they weren't inventing at all? Unless they were documenting? Why would the first civilization begin its history with beings that do not resemble humans at all? The answer lies in a document that shouldn't make sense. In 1906, German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht published his translation of a clay prism discovered at Nippur. The artifact listed every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until approximately 1800 BC. A comprehensive royal genealogy spanning what the Sumerians believed to be the entire history of civilization. Scholars expected a typical king list. Names, reign lengths, perhaps occasional propagandistic exaggerations. What they found instead was a document divided into two radically different sections, separated by a single phrase, "Then the flood swept over." Before that line, the Sumerian king list records 8 rulers whose reigns total 241,200 years. After the flood, reign lengths drop to recognizable human spans, sometimes decades, occasionally a century when exaggerated. The shift is so dramatic that for decades academics dismissed the pre-flood section as pure mythology, unworthy of serious analysis. But the Sumerians themselves drew no such distinction. The king list presents both sections with identical grammatical structure, identical formulaic phrasing, identical administrative precision. If the post-flood kings were historical, the text gives no indication that the pre-flood rulers were anything less. Consider the first king, Alulum of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. The text doesn't frame this as mythological time or divine allegory. It states his reign length the same way it states the 18-year reign of Lugal-Kitan of Uruk 3,000 years later. Second comes Alaga of Eridu, 36,000 years. Then Enmanluana of Bad Tibera, 43,200 years. The pattern continues through 8 rulers across 5 cities. Each reign measured in impossible spans, yet each treated as historical fact. But the reign lengths aren't the most unsettling detail. It's the descriptions that accompany certain names in variant copies of the list. Some rulers are called Lugal, the standard Sumerian word for king. Others are designated En, a term denoting both ruler and high priest, someone who mediates between realms. But several are preceded by the determinative dinger, the symbol that marks divine beings, those who came from elsewhere, not kings who became gods after death, beings who ruled while divine, before humanity had kings of its own. One fragmentary tablet from Larsa provides additional detail. It describes Enmandarana, 7th of the pre-flood rulers, as beloved of Anu, Enlil, and Ea, the 3 highest gods, and notes that he was taken to the assembly of the gods to learn the secrets of heaven and earth. When he returned, he taught humanity divination, omens, and the reading of celestial movements. The tablet adds one peculiar phrase. His appearance was like that of the gods, not like that of men. Physical difference, not metaphorical elevation. Meanwhile, another tradition recorded in later Babylonian texts claims that Enmandarana never died, but was taken up to dwell with the gods in the heavens. His successor, Ubartutu, became the last pre-flood king, father of Ziusadra, the Sumerian Noah, who survived the deluge in a great boat and preserved what remained of the old knowledge. Then the flood came. Then everything changed. Archaeological evidence suggests the change was more than mythological. When Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs at UR in 1929, he found an 8-foot layer of water-laid clay separating 2 distinct cultural periods. The stratum above showed Sumerian artifacts. Below lay remains of an earlier, less sophisticated culture buried beneath flood deposits. Woolley famously declared he'd found evidence of the biblical flood, though later analysis suggested a massive but regional inundation around 2900 BC. But the flood layer wasn't unique to UR. Excavations at Kish revealed similar water deposits. So did Shuruppak, the city where Ziusadra supposedly lived before the deluge. Each site showed the same pattern: destruction, flooding, then cultural rebuilding. Something had ended one era and begun another. Yet beneath those flood layers, something stranger emerged. At Eridu, identified by the Sumerians themselves as the oldest city, first seat of kingship before the flood, archaeologists uncovered 17 separate building levels. The temples descended deeper and deeper, each layer older than the last. By the time excavators reached the lowest levels, they found architectural techniques that predated anything recognizably Sumerian. Foundation stones showed different tool marks. Brickwork followed alternative patterns. Most puzzling, the deepest temple foundation sat atop virgin soil dated to approximately 5400 BC, nearly 2,000 years before Sumerian civilization supposedly began. Who built the first temples of Eridu? At Kish, flint tools emerged from strata carbon dated to 7000 BC, sophisticated blades and scrapers appearing in layers that supposedly predated human settlement of southern Mesopotamia. At Uruk, foundations beneath the White Temple incorporated limestone blocks weighing several tons, transported from quarries over 60 miles away, using methods that left no archaeological trace. The engineering required suggested organizational capacity far beyond what early Sumerian society should have possessed. Then there are the foundation deposits. Throughout Mesopotamia, builders placed inscribed cylinders beneath temple corners documenting who constructed the building and why. But some cylinders contain a peculiar phrase, restored according to the measurements left by the ancient ones, or rebuilt on foundations laid before the flood. Not metaphorical foundations. Specific measurements, specific plans, as though the builders were working from inherited blueprints. A cuneiform tablet from Babylon, dated to the 6th century BC but copied from older sources, describes the restoration of Esagila, the great temple of Marduk. The text explains that the architect used the original ground plan from before the deluge, which Ea drew on the clay of the Apsu before the flood. A plan drawn by Ea, the god of wisdom who dwelt in the deep waters, preserved through cataclysm and used to reconstruct what had been destroyed. The implication is unavoidable. The Sumerians believed they were rebuilding, not inventing. They saw themselves as inheritors of a world shaped by others who ruled for impossible spans, others who possessed knowledge beyond human discovery, others who vanished when water swept the earth clean. The king list makes this succession explicit. Before the flood, 8 rulers of extraordinary longevity, some marked as divine, governing from cities whose foundations descend into prehistory. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, not initiated for the first time but restored. The verb is crucial. You restore what existed before. You restore what was interrupted. Humanity didn't begin the institution of kingship. Humanity inherited it from whatever ruled before the waters rose. Modern scholarship dismisses the pre-flood section as allegory, cosmic time compressed into ruler lists, mythological figures dressed as kings. But the Sumerians never indicated such a reading. They preserved these names with the same administrative care they used for historical records. They built their cities atop older foundations. They claimed their knowledge was taught, not invented. And they insisted again and again across multiple textual traditions that something came before them, something that ruled, something that built, something that understood the heavens and the earth with a precision that took humanity millennia to relearn. Were these pre-flood rulers symbolic, or based on real species that existed before us? But the king list doesn't stand alone. Running parallel through Mesopotamian literature is another tradition older, stranger, and far more specific about what existed before the flood. The Sumerians called them Apkallu. The Akkadians called them Apkallu. Both terms translate roughly as sage or expert, but the beings they describe are anything but human. In the earliest references, scattered across temple hymns, incantations, and ritual texts, the Apkallu are presented as 7 figures who emerged from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, during the reign of the first pre-flood kings. Their purpose was explicit: to teach humanity the foundations of civilization. They instructed the first rulers in temple construction, irrigation engineering, agricultural cycles, legal codes, and the proper performance of religious rites. Everything that allowed cities to function came from these 7 teachers. But the texts never describe them as human. The most detailed account comes from the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC but drawing from temple archives that preserved much older Sumerian traditions. Berossus describes the first of the Apkallu, named Oannes, as a creature whose whole body was that of a fish, but underneath the fish's head was another head, and feet like a man's emerged from beneath the fish's tail. During daylight, Oannes would rise from the Persian Gulf, come ashore, and teach groups of early humans. At sunset, he would return to the sea. He consumed no food. He required no rest. He simply taught day after day, year after year. This wasn't presented as allegory. Berossus listed Oannes alongside historical Babylonian kings, described his physical appearance with zoological precision, and noted the specific knowledge he transmitted: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and the proper layout of cities. The other 6 Apkallu followed the same pattern. Amphibious beings who served as advisors to the pre-flood rulers, each associated with a particular city and a particular domain of expertise. Then the flood came and the Apkallu vanished. But their legacy remained, encoded in every institution the Sumerians built. The Apkallu appear consistently across 2 millennia of Mesopotamian art. Cylinder seals from the Uruk period, roughly 3200 to 3000 BC, show fish-scaled humanoids standing upright, their lower bodies covered in overlapping scales, their upper torsos bare and muscular. They hold staff-like objects and buckets, standing before seated human figures in postures of instruction or blessing. The iconography remains unchanged through the Akkadian period, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and into late Babylonian art. The same proportions, the same scales, the same positioning relative to humans. At the palace of Ashurnasirpal II in Nimrud, 9th century BC, massive stone reliefs depict 4-winged figures with bird heads and fish-scaled bodies flanking doorways. Cuneiform inscriptions identify them as protective Apkallu guardians, placed there according to the tradition from before the deluge. Not symbolic guardians. Actual beings whose forms were preserved in stone because those forms had meaning, had history, had power rooted in remembered reality. But perhaps most striking are the references in administrative contexts. A Middle Babylonian text from around 1400 BC lists the 7 Apkallu by name, associates each with a pre-flood king, and specifies which aspect of civilization each taught. The tablet treats them exactly as it treats historical scribes or craftsmen, as real individuals whose contributions could be catalogued and credited. No framing device signals myth. No linguistic markers suggest metaphor. One entry reads, Wana, who completed the plans for heaven and earth. Another, Wanduga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. A third, Emigalamna, who received the good me being the Sumerian term for the fundamental rules governing civilization, cosmic order, and technological knowledge. Meanwhile, temple foundation inscriptions from multiple periods invoke the Apkallu as historical precedent. When Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon's Esagila temple in the 7th century BC, the foundation cylinder declares, I restored it according to the ground plan from ancient times, the design which the Apkallu made before the flood, not inspired by myth, not guided by divine vision. According to the design the Apkallu made. The phrasing suggests something extraordinary. That specific architectural knowledge measurements, proportions, orientations had been preserved from before the deluge, passed down through generations, and attributed to non-human teachers who once walked among humans. The Epic of Gilgamesh reinforces this tradition. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality, he travels to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah. Utnapishtim lives, at the mouth of the rivers, in a dwelling that no man enters. When Gilgamesh finally meets him, Utnapishtim explains how he survived the deluge by building a cube-shaped boat according to precise instructions given by Ea, god of the Apsu. But the text adds a crucial detail. Ea's instructions were based on the ancient knowledge of the Apkallu, who knew the measurements of all things. Again, specific measurements, ancient knowledge, pre-flood origin. The consistency is what demands attention. Across 2,000 years, across multiple languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, the Apkallu remain unchanged. They're always 7. They always emerge from water. They always teach before the flood. They always serve specific kings. And they are always described with the same physical characteristics. Amphibious bodies, scales, human-like intelligence, immortal lifespans. Mythology tends to drift. Stories change as they're retold. Details shift. New embellishments appear. But the Apkallu don't drift. They're fixed points in the historical narrative, as stable as the king list itself. Modern scholars typically interpret them as personifications of wisdom, the idea of knowledge-bringing rendered in physical form. But this interpretation struggles against the evidence. Personifications don't appear in architectural inscriptions as sources of specific measurements. Personifications don't get listed in administrative catalogs alongside human officials. Personifications don't maintain identical physical descriptions across 20 centuries of artistic representation. The Sumerians had plenty of actual personifications, concepts like abundance, justice, and craft skill represented as divine attributes or abstract forces. But they treated those differently than the Apkallu. Personifications dwell in the realm of concept. The Apkallu dwell in the realm of action. They teach specific people in specific cities during specific reigns. They leave behind specific knowledge encoded in specific texts. One text from the library of Ashurbanipal, 7th century BC, but copied from much older sources, lists 7 tablets of foundational knowledge. Each tablet is attributed to one of the Apkallu. The subjects include temple architecture, astronomical calculation, medicinal plants, divination techniques, legal precedents, agricultural cycles, and metallurgical processes. These aren't abstract wisdom teachings. They're technical manuals, the kind of practical knowledge that allows civilization to function. And the text frames them as pre-flood transmissions. Knowledge given to humanity by beings who existed before the deluge erased the old world. Archaeological context deepens the mystery. Sites across Mesopotamia show sudden technological advancement around 3500 to 3200 BC. Sophisticated metallurgy, complex irrigation systems, astronomical record-keeping, and writing appear within a span of a few centuries. Standard models attribute this to gradual cultural development reaching a tipping point. But the Sumerians themselves credit it to instruction, to knowledge received rather than discovered. The Apkallu tradition provides their explanation. Civilization didn't evolve organically. It was taught by beings who remembered what existed before, beings who survived the catastrophe that ended the pre-flood world and chose to preserve what would otherwise be lost. In the ruins of Eridu, archaeologists found small clay figurines buried beneath temple foundations, offerings or protective charms placed during construction. Several depict fish-human hybrids in the characteristic Apkallu form. They're rough, ancient, created by hands that predated cuneiform writing. Someone made these figures before written records existed, suggesting the tradition of fishmen teachers stretched back even earlier than our oldest texts, which means the Apkallu weren't invented to explain civilization's origins. They were already there when writing began, already established in cultural memory, already depicted in art, already credited with shaping the world humanity inherited. The question stops being whether the Sumerians believed in the Apkallu. Clearly they did, across every period, in every city, in contexts both religious and administrative. The question becomes, what were they remembering? If the Apkallu were myth, why did the Sumerians document them like historical teachers? The answer may lie in what the Sumerians said about humanity's origin, and more importantly, what existed before us. Most creation myths frame human genesis as an act of pure divine will, gods shaping mortals from nothingness, breathing life into emptiness. But the Mesopotamian accounts follow a different logic. They don't describe creation from void. They describe replacement after failure. The clearest version appears in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text from around 1700 BC that draws from much older Sumerian sources. The opening lines establish a world already populated, already functioning, but populated by beings who are not human. The text calls them Ijajai, translated as lesser gods or junior deities, but their role is distinctly biological, not divine. They dig irrigation canals. They dredge rivers. They carry baskets of earth to build temple foundations. For 40 years, the text says, they labor without rest under the direction of the greater gods. Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Then they rebel. The Ijajai burn their tools, surround Enlil's temple, and refuse to work. The toil is too great, they declare. The forced labor too heavy. We cannot continue. Enlil, furious at the uprising, calls an assembly of the gods to decide the Ijajai's fate. Should they be destroyed? Punished? But Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters, proposes a different solution. Let us create a lulu, he says. A primitive worker, a replacement species designed specifically to perform the labor the Ijiji refuse. The phrasing is remarkable. Enki doesn't suggest calling humans into spiritual existence. He proposes engineering them. Let a god be slaughtered, he instructs. From his flesh and blood, let Nin to mix clay. Let God and man be bound together in the mixture, so that to the end of days, the flesh and the soul which in a god have ripened shall be in a bond we cannot break. This isn't metaphorical language. It's procedural. Mix flesh and blood with earth. Combine divine essence with terrestrial matter. Create a hybrid being capable of physical labor, but bound to the earth in a way the Ijiji were not. Nintu, the mother goddess, also called Beliali, follows the instructions precisely. The text describes her taking clay, mixing it with the blood of Weila, a slaughtered god, and shaping the mixture into forms. She creates 14 humans, 7 male, 7 female. The process is biological, almost clinical in its description. There's no divine breath, no spiritual awakening, just mixture, formation, and activation. Then comes a line that echoes through the rest of Mesopotamian literature. Let man assume the drudgery of God. Humans are assigned the labor the Ijiji abandoned. The rivers need dredging. The fields need tending. The temples need maintaining. Humanity's purpose isn't worship or enlightenment. It's work. But the text reveals something more unsettling. The Ijiji don't disappear after humanity's creation. They remain present in the narrative, watching, occasionally interacting with humans. The Atrahasis epic describes them dwelling in the heights, while humans multiply on the earth below. The vertical separation suggests two species occupying different zones of the same world, one replaced in function but not entirely removed from existence. Later, when humanity grows too numerous and too noisy, Enlil attempts to reduce the population through plague, drought, and finally flood. But Enki warns one human, Atrahasis himself, to build a boat. The flood comes. Humanity survives through a single family. And after the waters recede, the Ijiji descend once more to marvel at the smoke of the first post-flood sacrifice. The creation account in the Enuma Elish follows similar logic, though with different details. Here, humanity is created from the blood of Kingu, a rebel god defeated in cosmic war. Marduk orders Kingu's execution, and from his blood, Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, fashions humans to serve the gods. Again, replacement labor. Again, biological procedure. Again, a species created to perform tasks another species refused. What's striking about both texts is their refusal to present humans as the pinnacle of creation. We're not the primary beings in these narratives. We're the solution to a labor shortage. We exist because something else stopped working. The biological language is consistent across multiple versions. Clay mixed with blood. Flesh bound to earth. Divine essence limited by terrestrial form. These phrases recur in Sumerian hymns, Akkadian prayers, and Babylonian rituals, always framing human origin as a kind of genetic engineering, a deliberate hybridization of materials to produce a species with specific capabilities and limitations. One hymn to Enki describes the creation process as tempering the clay as one tempers copper, a metallurgical metaphor, suggesting precise ratios, controlled conditions, iterative refinement. Another text notes that early human prototypes failed. Some were barren, some malformed, some incapable of speech. Only after adjustments did viable humans emerge. This isn't how mythology typically handles creation. Mythological origins are usually instantaneous, perfect, ordained. But these texts describe trial and error, problem-solving, engineering constraints. They read less like religious poetry and more like technical reports from a biological project with specific goals. The implications grow heavier the longer you sit with them. If the Ijiji were laborers who rebelled, what were they? The texts call them gods. But gods who dig canals, who grow tired, who burn tools in protest. Their behavior is biological, their needs physical, their grievances material. They sound less like divine beings and more like a previous species, perhaps one that also served, also labored, until the burden became unbearable. And if humans were created to replace them, it suggests a pattern. Species designed for labor, eventually refusing, eventually replaced. The Ijiji replaced someone earlier. Humans replaced the Ijiji. The cycle implies repetition. A long history of workers rising and falling before our chapter began. Some scholars argue the texts are social commentary, critiquing Mesopotamian labor systems by projecting them onto cosmic scale. But this interpretation struggles against the consistency of the biological framing. If the Ijiji were metaphors for human workers, why describe them as dwelling in the sky? Why differentiate their bloodlines from human bloodlines in later king lists? Why show them attending divine assemblies that exclude humans? The texts treat them as separate, as prior, as something that came before and remained distinct even after humanity emerged. Archaeological parallels deepen the mystery. Genetic studies of ancient Mesopotamian populations reveal unusual diversity in the earliest layers, multiple ancestral lineages converging in southern Iraq around 4000 BC, suggesting different groups merged to form what we call Sumerian civilization. Some researchers propose this represents displaced populations migrating after climate catastrophe. But the Sumerian texts suggest something stranger. That different types of beings coexisted, that some taught while others learned, that humanity emerged not in isolation but in the presence of others who shaped our early development. The creation myths frame this not as cultural contact but as biological succession. One species steps back, another takes over, knowledge transfers, labor continues, the world rebuilds. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero encounters Enkidu, described as created from clay by the goddess Aruru in response to Gilgamesh's tyranny. Enkidu begins wild, covered in hair, living among animals. But Shamhat, the temple priestess, civilizes him through 7 days of sexual union, after which Enkidu gains speech, understanding, and human behavior. The process mirrors the Atrahasis creation. Raw material shaped, then activated through mixture with divine essence. But Enkidu remains partially other. He possesses superhuman strength, understands animal languages, and dreams prophetic visions denied to ordinary humans. He's a hybrid, caught between categories much like humanity itself, according to these texts. Part clay, part divine blood, capable of civilization but marked by something older, something mixed into our foundation that we no longer recognize. The texts return obsessively to this theme. Humans are not pure creation but composite beings assembled from the remains of what came before. We carry traces of earlier species in our blood, our form, our purpose. We were made to continue work that others started, to maintain systems we did not design, to inhabit a world already shaped by hands that were not our own. Who were these workers that came before humans? And why did they vanish? The texts could be dismissed as elaborate metaphor, if not for what survives in stone. Across 4,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, from the earliest Sumerian settlements to the fall of Babylon, artists carved the same figures into cylinder seals, palace walls, temple gates, and boundary stones. Not occasionally, not as decorative flourishes, constantly, systematically, with anatomical precision that suggests these forms carried weight beyond symbolism. Walk through the Mesopotamian galleries of any major museum, and the pattern becomes inescapable. The beings depicted alongside humans are not stylized abstractions. They have muscle structure, joint articulation, skeletal proportions that remain consistent across centuries of artistic tradition. And they appear in contexts that frame them not as mythological ornament but as active participants in human affairs. Teaching, blessing, measuring, guarding, shaping the world. The most common form shows a humanoid figure with the head of a bird, typically an eagle or a falcon. These beings stand upright on 2 legs, their bodies muscular and human proportioned from the neck down, but their heads distinctly avian. Curved beaks, forward-facing eyes, feathered crests. They appear in Sumerian cylinder seals from 3000 BC, in Akkadian reliefs from 2300 BC, in Neo-Assyrian palace walls from 700 BC. The iconography spans 2,300 years without significant variation. At the palace of Ashurnasirpal II in Nimrud, built around 865 BC, Massive stone slabs show these bird-headed figures standing over 8 feet tall, dwarfing the human attendants beside them. They hold pine cones in one hand and small buckets in the other, reaching towards stylized trees in gestures that reliefs label as blessing or purifying. Their wings, 4 in some depictions, 2 in others, extend symmetrically from their backs, feathered in careful detail that distinguishes primary flight feathers from secondary coverts. Cuneiform captions identify them as apkallu, the same term used for the 7 pre-flood sages. But here they're depicted in active ritual roles, not as distant mythological figures. They perform ceremonies alongside Assyrian kings. They flank doorways as protective guardians. They appear in scenes showing the establishment of temples, the blessing of crops, the consecration of sacred objects. The scale is deliberate. When human figures and bird-headed beings appear together, the proportional difference remains consistent. The beings stand roughly 1.5 times human height. This isn't artistic exaggeration varying from piece to piece. It's a maintained ratio, suggesting the size difference carried meaning, perhaps memory of actual physical distinction between species. Then there are the reptilian forms, less common than the bird-headed apkallu but equally detailed. These figures show humanoid bodies covered in scale patterns that follow natural anatomical lines. Smaller scales on joints where flexibility is needed, larger overlapping scales on the torso and thighs. Some wear short kilts and elaborate jewelry. Others appear unclothed, their scaled skin rendered with care that distinguishes texture from decorative pattern. A boundary stone from the Kassite period, around 1300 BC, shows one such being standing in profile, holding a staff topped with the omega symbol, sign of divine authority. The figure's head is distinctly non-human. Elongated skull, ridge running from forehead to crown, eyes positioned slightly more lateral than frontal. But the posture is upright, the hands human-like, the bearing dignified. The stone's inscription refers to the guardian of the ancient boundary, set by those who measured before the flood. Not symbolic guardians. Those who measured, past tense, specific action. The winged humanoids present a different puzzle. These beings, often called Shidu or Lamassu in later Akkadian texts, combine human heads with leonine or bovine bodies and massive wings. But earlier Sumerian versions show fully humanoid forms with wings attached at the shoulder blades, standing upright, walking on 2 legs. They wear elaborate robes, multi-tiered headdresses, and jewelry that includes circular bracelets and rosette-shaped brooches. What's remarkable is the detail applied to their wings. Artists didn't render them as simplified symbolic elements. They showed individual feathers, proper wing articulation at the shoulder joint, and anatomically plausible span ratios. On a cylinder seal from UR, dated to approximately 2600 BC, a winged figure's feathers are individually carved, primaries, secondaries, and coverts arranged in the pattern found in actual bird wings. The effort required suggests the form mattered, that accuracy served a purpose beyond decoration. These beings appear in scenes of cosmic significance. They assist in creation events, hold measuring ropes during temple foundations, stand witness at divine assemblies. But they also appear in administrative contexts, on seals used by priests and officials, on tablets recording temple dedications, on boundary markers defining property lines. The sacred and the bureaucratic blur together, suggesting these forms weren't confined to religious imagination but penetrated everyday institutional life. Above many of these non-human figures appears a specific symbol, the 8-pointed star, sign of the Dinger, the determinative marking divine or sky-originated beings. But the symbol appears selectively. Human kings don't receive it. Human priests don't receive it. It marks only those beings with non-human anatomy. The bird-headed, the scaled, the winged, the hybrid forms. The differentiation is systematic enough to suggest taxonomy, a visual grammar distinguishing categories of beings by origin, nature, or function. At Eridu, archaeologists uncovered small clay plaques buried in foundation deposits, offerings placed when temples were constructed. Several show crude but recognizable forms. Fish-human hybrids, bird-headed figures, beings with elongated skulls. These weren't formal art pieces meant for display. They were ritual objects buried where no human eye would see them again. suggesting their significance ran deeper than aesthetic tradition. The consistency across time and space becomes difficult to explain through conventional frameworks. Artistic motifs usually evolve. Egyptian deities shift in representation. Greek gods change attributes. But the Mesopotamian hybrid beings remain stable. The bird-headed Apkallu of 3000 BC look essentially identical to those carved in 700 BC. Same proportions, same gestures, same ritual contexts. It's as if the forms were fixed by something more binding than artistic convention. Some art historians suggest these represent shamanic transformations, priests wearing ritual masks, their spiritual states visualized as bodily changes. But this explanation struggles against the evidence. When humans wear masks in Mesopotamian art, the masks are clearly depicted as objects placed over faces. Straps are visible. Human features show beneath. The hybrid beings show no such seams. Their non-human features integrate seamlessly with their bodies, rendered as biological reality rather than costume. Moreover, the beings are shown performing tasks that humans in the same scenes do not. Holding objects humans cannot hold, standing in positions humans cannot occupy, interacting with cosmic elements, tree of life, celestial symbols, divine assemblies that remain inaccessible to human figures in adjacent panels. The architectural context deepens the mystery. At the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, built around 575 BC, the walls display alternating rows of bulls and mushashu, dragon-like creatures with serpentine necks, leonine forelegs, and avian hind legs. The mushashu appears nowhere in nature, yet its depiction remains anatomically coherent. Muscles attach logically. Joints articulate properly. Weight distribution makes biomechanical sense. Whoever designed these forms understood anatomy well enough to create plausible hybrid organisms. The inscription on the gate credits its construction to Nebuchadnezzar II, but notes the decorative program follows, the pattern set by the builders of old, who knew the forms of the guardians. Again, knowledge transmitted from earlier builders, forms inherited rather than invented. In 1936, archaeologist Max Malawan excavated a temple at Nimrud and found a series of small bronze figurines buried beneath the floor. The figures depicted the standard hybrid forms: bird-headed humanoids, fish-scaled beings, winged figures with animal attributes. But chemical analysis revealed something unexpected. The bronze alloy matched techniques from the Akkadian period, around 2300 BC. Yet the figures were buried during Neo-Assyrian construction, around 800 BC, suggesting the objects were already ancient when interred, treated as precious relics from a much earlier time. The Assyrians were preserving artifacts already 1,500 years old, artifacts depicting beings they still recognized as significant. The continuity of tradition spans not just centuries but millennia, each generation inheriting forms they did not create, maintaining images whose origins receded into unrecorded time. What could sustain such consistency? Religious doctrine alone rarely maintains iconographic precision across 2,000 years. Mythological beings drift, merge, transform. But these forms don't drift. They remain distinct, detailed, differentiated, as if locked by something stronger than tradition. Perhaps by memory. Why did the Sumerians preserve these non-human forms with such anatomical precision? The images preserve what words describe, but both point toward the same dividing line: the flood. Every Mesopotamian tradition, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, records a catastrophic deluge that ended one world and began another. The story appears in the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and dozens of fragmentary texts spanning 3 millennia. The details vary slightly. Sometimes the survivor is called Zayusadra, sometimes Atrahasis, sometimes Utnapishtim. But the core narrative remains constant. The gods decide to destroy the world with water. One deity warns a righteous man. The man builds a boat. The flood comes. Everything dies except what shelters in the boat. The waters recede. The survivor makes sacrifice. The gods regret their decision. Life begins again. For centuries, scholars treated this as pure mythology, moral allegory about divine judgment and human survival. Then archaeologists started digging into the oldest Sumerian cities, and they found water. In 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur when his workers struck a layer of clean, water-deposited clay nearly 8 feet thick. Below this clay layer lay artifacts from an earlier culture. Above it, the recognizable remains of Sumerian civilization. The separation was absolute. Whatever had happened between those layers had been violent enough to bury one world beneath sediment and allow another to rise on top of it. Woolley famously declared he'd found evidence of the biblical flood. Newspapers ran headlines about proof of Noah's deluge. But subsequent analysis complicated the claim. The flood layer at Ur dated to approximately 2900 BC, far too recent to represent a global cataclysm. And more problematic, similar flood deposits at other sites didn't align chronologically. Kish showed flooding around 2900 BC. Shuruppak showed evidence of destruction around 2700 BC. Uruk's flood layers dated differently still. What archaeologists had found wasn't one universal deluge but evidence of recurring regional floods. Massive, devastating, but localized to southern Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates river system is prone to catastrophic flooding when snowmelt from the Zagros Mountains coincides with heavy spring rains. Cities built on floodplains without modern drainage or protective levees would have been utterly defenseless. But here's what unsettled researchers. The Sumerian flood accounts don't describe a regional disaster. They describe the end of an entire era. Not just cities destroyed but species vanished. Not just populations displaced but knowledge lost. The texts frame the flood not as one catastrophe among many but as the catastrophe, the event that separated before from after, the old world from the new. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving version of the flood story, makes this explicit. Before the flood, the text describes a world populated by multiple types of beings. Humans, yes, but also the Igigi who labored, the Apkallu who taught, the pre-flood kings who ruled for impossible spans. After the flood, only humans remain. The others have vanished. Kingship descended from heaven once more, but it descended to human rulers now, not to the giants and shining ones who governed before. The shift isn't presented as symbolic. It's presented as biological succession. One ecosystem ended, another began. Species that existed before the waters rose do not exist after. At Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra supposedly lived before the flood, excavations revealed a destruction layer marked by fire and subsequent flooding. But what's more intriguing is what lies beneath. The pre-flood layers at Shuruppak contain architecture that doesn't match later Sumerian building techniques. Foundations follow different angles. Brickwork uses different bonding patterns. Most tellingly, some structures show evidence of construction methods that required organizational capacity beyond what early settlements should have possessed. Large-scale irrigation works appear fully formed in these deep layers, canals spanning miles, levee systems controlling water flow, distribution networks suggesting centralized planning. The engineering implies not trial-and-error development but inherited expertise. Someone had already figured out how to manage these river systems before the Sumerians rebuilt on top of the ruins. Then there's the silence below the flood layers. Across multiple sites, artifact density drops dramatically. It's not that nothing exists, tools appear, pottery fragments, occasional structures, but the archaeological record becomes sparse, scattered, difficult to interpret. Above the flood layers, Sumerian civilization appears robust, documented, continuous. Below them, whatever culture existed left only shadows. The Sumerian texts offer an explanation. The flood erased not just cities but entire populations. Not just humans but other beings who shared the world before the waters came. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood's aftermath with ecological specificity. Utnapishtim releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to test for dry land. The first two return. The raven does not, it finds carrion to feed on, corpses left by the deluge. The detail is haunting. A world covered in death, an extinction event written into sacred literature. Other texts elaborate. A fragmentary tablet from Nippur describes the pre-flood world as populated by those who came from the sky, those who rose from the Abzu, and those made from clay, 3 distinct categories of beings, each with different origins, coexisting before the catastrophe. After the flood, the tablet notes, only those made from clay remain numerous. The others have returned to their places or descended into the earth, or simply ceased to appear in human affairs. The language suggests not mythological departure but biological extinction, or, at minimum, severe population collapse. Species that once interacted with humans are no longer present in sufficient numbers to shape human history. Modern geological research offers context. The period between 3500 to 2900 BC saw significant climate instability in the Near East. The end of the Uruk period coincides with evidence of major flooding events, possible tsunami deposits in the Persian Gulf, and sudden cultural disruptions across Mesopotamia. Some researchers propose a catastrophic breach of the Black Sea basin around this time, sending massive water volumes downstream. Others point to megafloods caused by glacial lake outbursts in the Zagros Mountains. Any of these events could have devastated the river valleys where Sumerian cities clustered. But what makes the Sumerian accounts distinctive is their insistence that the flood destroyed more than human settlements. It destroyed a multi-species ecosystem, one where beings with different origins, different anatomies, different lifespans lived alongside early humans, teaching and ruling until the waters came. The tablets describe pre-flood cities as places where the divine and the mortal dwelt together, where the sages emerged from the sea each dawn, where the shining ones walked among the people. These aren't isolated poetic phrases. They appear in king lists, temple hymns, administrative records, creation accounts, the full spectrum of Sumerian literature. Then the flood, then silence, then only humans. Archaeological evidence shows that after the major flood deposits around 2900 to 2700 BC, Mesopotamian culture reorganizes. Sumerian city-states emerge with new political structures. Temple architecture follows standardized forms. Writing becomes widespread, but the continuity with what came before is broken. The deep foundations, the inherited astronomy, the pre-flood king lists, all point backward to something older, now buried beneath water-laid clay. One text from UR describes a post-flood king restoring a temple on the foundation that existed before the waters, when the seven sages dwelt among us. The nostalgia is palpable, a sense that something irreplaceable was lost, that the world after the flood was diminished, that humanity now built alone where once they had built with others. If the flood accounts preserve memory of a real catastrophe, they preserve something else too. The memory of a world more diverse than ours. Not diverse in human cultures, but diverse in intelligent species. A world where fishmen taught agriculture, where bird-headed beings blessed crops, where giants ruled cities, where beings with scaled skin and radiant faces walked among humans as teachers, rulers, craftsmen. Then water covered everything. And when the water receded, only one species remained dominant enough to rebuild. If the flood erased entire species, could traces of them still lie beneath Sumer's oldest ruins? The answer might be buried beneath the cities themselves. Archaeologists don't dig down expecting mystery. They dig expecting progression. Simple foundations giving way to more complex ones, crude structures evolving into sophisticated architecture. Cultural development should be legible in the layers, each stratum marking advancement, each level showing how previous generations learned and improved. But at the oldest Sumerian sites, the pattern reverses. Eridu stands as the most unsettling example. According to Sumerian tradition, it was the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, where Enki established his temple, where civilization began. The king list opens with, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not founded by humans, lowered, given, inherited. When Iraqi and British archaeologists excavated Eridu's temple complex in the 1940s and 1950s, they uncovered 17 distinct building phases stacked vertically, each temple constructed directly atop the ruins of its predecessor. The uppermost layers dated to the early dynastic period, around 2500 BC. But as excavators descended, the temples grew older, cruder in some ways, yet stranger in others. By the time they reached the lowest levels, around Temple 16 and Temple 17, they found structures dated to approximately 5400 BC, Nearly 2,000 years before Sumerian civilization supposedly emerged, the temple sat on virgin soil, meaning nothing human had been there before, at least nothing that left archaeological traces we recognize. But the architecture posed questions that remain unanswered. The earliest temples already show orientation toward cardinal directions, already incorporate sacred geometry in their proportions, already use mudbrick sizes standardized to ratios that later Sumerian builders would maintain for millennia. There's no experimental phase, no trial structures showing how builders learned these principles. The knowledge appears embedded in the first iteration, as if whoever built Temple 16 already knew exactly what they were doing. The foundation deposits deepen the puzzle. Beneath several of the early temples, excavators found small caches of objects: carved stones, copper tools, shell beads. Some items matched expected dates. Others didn't. A few copper implements showed metallurgical sophistication that shouldn't exist in 5400 BC alloy ratios, requiring temperature control and mixing techniques that standard models place 1,000 years later. One archaeologist noted in his field report, "It's as though someone else built the first temple, then left instructions." At Uruk, the pattern repeats with variations. Beneath the White Temple, Uruk's most prominent ziggurat, dating to around 3200 BC, excavations revealed older foundations using construction techniques that don't appear anywhere else in the Sumerian architectural record. The foundation stones were shaped with tools that left cut marks inconsistent with copper or bronze implements. Some blocks showed evidence of extreme heat application, perhaps to harden the surface, but fired at temperatures that required kiln technology supposedly unavailable in the early 4th millennium BC. More puzzling, the stone itself came from quarries over 60 miles away. Transporting multi-ton blocks across that distance required logistics, labor organization, and engineering capacity that excavators struggled to attribute to the scattered villages that supposedly preceded Uruk's urbanization. A German archaeological team working the site in the 1930s documented massive limestone blocks forming the lowest course of the temple platform. The blocks fit together with minimal mortar, their surfaces dressed to near-perfect flatness. The report noted, "The precision suggests experience. Yet these are the oldest structural elements we found. Where did the builders learn these techniques?" The question was never satisfactorily answered. Kish presents perhaps the most direct challenge to standard chronology. Located north of Ur, Kish served as a major Sumerian city-state and appears in the king list as the seat of kingship immediately after the flood. But excavations in the 1920s and again in the 1980s uncovered artifacts beneath the flood layer that shouldn't exist. Flint blades dated to 700 BC. Obsidian tools showing evidence of long-distance trade networks. Pottery fragments using firing techniques and decorative patterns that don't match any known early Mesopotamian culture. Most disturbing, in one deep trench, excavators found a limestone foundation block carved with symbols that resemble proto-cuneiform but predate the invention of writing by over 1,000 years. The archaeologists published the findings but offered no interpretation. The symbols remain undeciphered. The foundation block sits in a Baghdad museum, catalogued but unexplained. What connects these sites is the consistent presence of older, anomalous layers beneath recognized Sumerian construction. Not just natural settlement mounds where debris gradually accumulates, but intentional architecture. Foundations, walls, platforms built by hands that predated the Sumerians and apparently possessed knowledge the Sumerians would later inherit. The Sumerian texts acknowledge this inheritance openly. Temple foundation inscriptions frequently include phrases like, "restored to its original plan," or "rebuilt according to ancient measurements." One inscription from Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BC, describes rebuilding Eridu's temple on the foundations laid by the lords of old, in the measurements they established before the waters came. Before the waters, before the flood. Measurements established by someone else, preserved through catastrophe, used by later builders who credited their architectural knowledge to teachers from an earlier age. Could Sumerian cities simply be the latest iteration of much older urban centers? Could the first cities have been preceded by others now erased by time, flood, and sand, leaving only their deepest foundations as evidence? Some researchers have proposed that rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age around 10,000 to 6,000 BC, inundated earlier settlements in the Persian Gulf Basin. As waters rose, populations retreated inland, bringing with them knowledge, techniques, and memories of what had been lost. The Sumerians would then represent not the inventors of civilization but its inheritors, rebuilding on higher ground, using principles carried forward from submerged cities. But the texts suggest something more specific than human migration. They don't describe humans fleeing floods and re-establishing elsewhere. They describe other beings teaching humans how to rebuild, how to measure, how to align temples with celestial points. The Apkallu emerge from the sea not as refugees but as instructors, bringing knowledge from before the flood to humanity after. The architecture supports this narrative. The oldest temples don't show human populations slowly learning urban planning. They show complete systems implemented immediately. Standardized bricks, aligned orientations, proportional geometry, as if the builders were following plans, not inventing them. One possibility remains largely unspoken in academic literature but whispered in site reports and excavation notes. What if the deepest layers of Sumerian cities weren't built by humans at all? What if the first temples at Eridu, the first platforms at Uruk, the first foundations at Kish were constructed by the very beings the texts describe, those who existed before the flood, those who possessed knowledge they would eventually transmit to the humans who survived? It would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated construction techniques. It would explain why temple rebuilding consistently invokes ancient measurements. It would explain why architectural knowledge seems inherited rather than developed. And it would mean the oldest Sumerian cities weren't founded by the Sumerians. They were inherited, passed down, built originally by species that vanished before human dominance, leaving only their foundations and their instructions for those who came after. If humans did not build the first layers of Sumer cities, then who did? But the deepest inheritance might not be architectural. It might be written in the stars. Of all the knowledge the Sumerians possessed, their astronomical understanding remains the most difficult to explain through conventional development models. Astronomy requires more than observation. It demands continuous record-keeping across generations, mathematical frameworks for calculating celestial movements, and conceptual models sophisticated enough to predict planetary positions years in advance. The Sumerians had all of this immediately from the earliest periods. The Mul.Appen tablets, named after their opening words, the plow star, represent the oldest surviving comprehensive star catalog. Compiled around 1000 BC but copied from much earlier sources, these tablets list constellations, track stellar rising and setting times, record planetary movements, and provide mathematical formulas for predicting lunar eclipses and planetary conjunctions. The precision is extraordinary. Modern astronomers confirm that the Venus cycle documented in Mul.Appen matches actual orbital mechanics to within days over multi-year periods. But here's what unsettles scholars. The tablets explicitly identify themselves as copies. The scribes note they are preserving the star knowledge of the ancients, and the measurements recorded by those who came before, not observations made by contemporary Babylonian astronomers. Inherited data. Ancient records transcribed to prevent loss. How ancient? Textual analysis suggests the source material dates to at least 2400 BC, possibly earlier. Some calculations embedded in the tablets reflect celestial positions from the 3rd millennium BC, suggesting observers were tracking these patterns when Uruk and Ur were just establishing themselves as major cities. Yet even those early Sumerian observations show no learning curve. The mathematics is already sophisticated. The base 60 number system, still used today for measuring time and angles, appears fully formed in the earliest mathematical tablets. No simpler systems precede it. No gradual refinement shows how Sumerians developed this peculiar but remarkably efficient way of calculating. 60 is not an intuitive base for human counting. Most cultures default to base 10, fingers, or base 20, fingers and toes. But base 60 allows for easy division by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it exceptionally useful for astronomical calculation, where you need to divide circles into precise segments and track recurring cycles that don't align to simple multiples. It's the system someone would design if they wanted to track celestial mechanics efficiently. And it appears in Sumer with no prehistory, no prototypes, no explanation for why this particular system was chosen. The Sumerians themselves provided an answer, though modern scholars rarely take it literally. Temple hymns and astronomical texts repeatedly credit their celestial knowledge to beings they call the Watchers, or those who measure the heavens. These aren't metaphors for human observers. The texts differentiate clearly between human astronomers and these earlier measurers. One tablet fragment from Nippur states, "The divisions of the heavens were set by those who came before the flood, who established the stations of the stars and marked the paths of the wanderers. The wanderers are planets, objects whose movements require decades of observation to map accurately." The text credits this mapping not to human effort but to pre-flood observers who established the system humans would later inherit. Another text describes Enki, god of wisdom, and the Abzu, as possessing the tablet of destinies on which the courses of the stars are written from times before the beginning of kingship, before human civilization. The knowledge is framed as ancient inheritance, not contemporary discovery. Archaeological evidence supports unusual astronomical sophistication. Temple orientations across Sumer align with remarkable precision to solstice sunrise positions. The ziggurat at Ur points to the summer solstice sunset. Eridu's main temple axes align with the winter solstice dawn. These aren't approximate orientations, they're accurate to within 1 degree, suggesting builders used precise observation tools and understood how to translate celestial positions into architectural alignments. But the technology required for such precision shouldn't exist in the 4th millennium BC. You need instruments capable of measuring angles to fractions of a degree. You need mathematical tables for converting observations into usable coordinates. You need multi-generational record-keeping to account for the slow drift of celestial positions, or you need teachers who already possess this knowledge. Cuneiform texts describe these teachers explicitly. The Apkallu, those 7 pre-flood sages, are repeatedly credited with bringing the knowledge of the heavens to humanity. One text lists their teachings: the interpretation of omens, the observation of the sky, the calculation of eclipses, the measurement of time. Another describes them as those who knew the movements of the celestial bodies and the fixed stars. Cylinder seals reinforce this connection. Several show non-human figures, bird-headed beings, winged humanoids, holding objects identified as measuring ropes and surveying rods, the same tools that appear in astronomical contexts used for calculating angles and distances. One seal from the Akkadian period depicts a fishman holding what appears to be a calibrated staff pointed toward a star symbol, suggesting direct association between the Apkallu and celestial measurement. Then there's the question of precession. The Earth's axis wobbles over a 26,000-year cycle, causing the position of stars to drift slowly relative to the horizon. This drift is barely perceptible within a human lifetime but becomes significant over centuries. Modern astronomy only confirmed precession in the 2nd century BC through Greek observations. Yet some researchers argue that Sumerian mythology encodes awareness of this cycle. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes 12 cosmic ages, each associated with a zodiacal constellation. The ages shift in reverse order through the zodiac, the same direction precession moves. The text describes these shifts as taking long years beyond counting, which matches the multimillennial timescale of precession. If the Sumerians knew about precession, they were tracking stellar positions across time periods longer than their civilization's documented existence. Either they inherited records spanning thousands of years, records kept by observers who preceded them, or they possessed mathematical models sophisticated enough to extrapolate precessional drift from shorter observation periods. Both options suggest knowledge beyond what early urban cultures should independently develop. A tablet from Ashurbanipal's library, copying much older material, describes astronomy as the secret of the gods which the sages brought from the Apsu before the flood destroyed their dwelling places. The phrasing is specific. Knowledge brought from somewhere else, by beings from elsewhere, before catastrophe ended their presence. The text continues, "What they recorded remains in the heavens, and the wise study what the ancient ones measured." Present tense, the measurements still exist, still visible, still studied, but attributed to observers older than human civilization. Throughout Mesopotamian astronomical texts, this theme repeats. Knowledge is inherited, measurements were established long ago. The patterns humans observe were first recorded by those who came before. Even the language used suggests reception rather than discovery. We were taught, instead of we learned. They instructed, rather than we observed. If taken literally, these texts describe humanity receiving astronomy not through gradual observation but through direct transmission from beings who already possessed comprehensive celestial knowledge, beings the Sumerians depicted with non-human features, beings they associated with the pre-flood era, beings they credited with measuring the heavens before humans had the capacity to do so. Were the Sumerians recording the astronomy of another species entirely? The evidence converges into a single, inescapable question. If these beings existed, if the Sumerians documented them with such consistency, such specificity, such anatomical precision, where did they go? We've traced their presence through multiple lines of evidence. The king list records pre-flood rulers who reigned for impossible spans, marked with the dinger symbol denoting sky origin. The Atrahasis epic describes Igigi laborers who existed before humans, who rebelled, who were replaced by our species. The Apkallu tradition documents 7 amphibious teachers who emerged from the Apsu to instruct humanity in civilization's foundations. Cylinder seals and palace reliefs show bird-headed beings, scaled humanoids, winged figures, maintaining consistent anatomical forms across 2,000 years of artistic tradition. Archaeological digs reveal older foundations beneath Sumerian cities. Temples at Eridu descending to 5400 BC, anomalous tools at Kish predating known settlement by millennia, construction techniques at Uruk suggesting inherited expertise. Astronomical tablets preserve knowledge attributed to those who measured before us, star catalogs copied from sources older than Sumer itself, base 60 mathematics appearing fully formed with no developmental prehistory. The texts, the art, the architecture, the astronomy all point toward the same conclusion. The Sumerians believed they coexisted with, learned from, and eventually inherited the world from species that preceded them. Species they described not as myths or symbols but as physical beings with specific anatomies, specific roles, specific knowledge to transmit. Then, abruptly, these beings vanish from the record. After approximately 2900 to 2700 BC, the period of major flood deposits across southern Mesopotamia, references to non-human teachers and rulers decline sharply. The Apkallu are spoken of in past tense. The pre-flood kings become legendary rather than contemporary. The giant rulers, the shining ones, the beings from sky and sea fade into memory, invoked in temple inscriptions but no longer depicted as active participants in human affairs. What happened between those dates? 3 possibilities emerge from the evidence, none mutually exclusive. First, catastrophic extinction. Every Mesopotamian tradition describes the flood as species ending, not merely civilization ending. The Eridu Genesis states that after the deluge, kingship had to descend from heaven once more, implying the previous holders of kingship no longer existed to transfer power. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's flood as covering the earth like a battle, destroying all living things. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim releases birds to search for survivors and finds only corpses. The language throughout these accounts suggests biological catastrophe, not just political collapse. The flood doesn't merely destroy cities, it erases entire populations, entire lineages, entire categories of beings. The texts mourn this loss. One fragment from Nippur laments, "The world before the waters knew many forms of wisdom, many shapes of life. After the waters, only one form remained to carry the burden." Geological evidence confirms that the period between 3500 to 2700 BC saw significant climate instability and flooding across Mesopotamia. The Persian Gulf coastline changed dramatically. River courses shifted. Cities drowned. If pre-human species populations were already small, already localized to specific regions, perhaps the coastal zones where the Apkallu supposedly emerged, or highland areas where the Anunnaki were said to dwell, a catastrophic flood could have reduced them below viable breeding populations. Extinction doesn't require killing every individual. It only requires reducing numbers below the threshold where recovery becomes impossible. A species numbering in the hundreds, scattered across flood-prone valleys, could vanish in a single catastrophic season. Second, deliberate withdrawal. Multiple texts describe non-human beings not dying but departing. The Apkallu returned to the Apsu after teaching humanity. Some pre-flood rulers were taken to dwell with the gods in the heavens. Enki and Enlil, after deciding to flood the earth, retreat to their respective domains, Enki to the underwater palace, Enlil to the mountain heights. The language suggests intentional removal rather than forced extinction. One Akkadian text describes the post-flood world as a place where the divine ones withdrew to watch from afar, no longer walking among the children of clay. Another states, they returned to the places from which they first came, leaving humanity to tend the world alone. If these beings possessed the knowledge attributed to them, sophisticated astronomy, advanced architecture, understanding of celestial cycles, they might have predicted the coming catastrophe and chosen to leave before it arrived. Perhaps they returned to homelands beyond Mesopotamia, regions now underwater or buried beneath sand. Perhaps some retreated to remote areas where their descendants persisted in isolation, eventually dying out or interbreeding into obscurity. The text's insistence that these beings came from the sky and from the sea might indicate origins elsewhere, coastal cities now submerged by rising sea levels, or highland settlements erased by time. Their disappearance from Mesopotamian records doesn't necessarily mean extinction. It might mean departure, their presence in Sumerian memory marking a period of contact that eventually ended. Third, assimilation. The creation myths consistently describe humans as hybrid beings, clay mixed with divine blood, earth combined with the essence of slaughtered gods. What if this wasn't metaphor? What if the Sumerians were describing actual genetic intermixing between species? The Epic of Gilgamesh presents Enkidu as exactly this kind of hybrid. Created from clay by the goddess Aruru, civilized through contact with Shamhat, possessing superhuman strength but human enough to befriend Gilgamesh and dwell in Uruk. He's described as transitional, neither fully wild nor fully civilized, neither purely divine nor purely human. Several texts describe pre-flood beings interbreeding with humans. The Book of Giants, preserved in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls but drawing from older Mesopotamian sources, describes the sons of the Watchers as hybrid offspring of divine beings and human women. These hybrids possess unusual characteristics: enormous size, exceptional strength, knowledge beyond normal human capacity. But they're also mortal, bound to earth, unable to return to their parents' original dwelling places. If interbreeding occurred over generations, the distinct non-human species would gradually disappear into the expanding human gene pool. Their unique features would dilute. Their knowledge would be partially transmitted but incompletely preserved. Eventually, only humans would remain, but humans carrying traces of the species that came before, fragments of their genetics and their wisdom encoded in bloodlines and cultural memory. This would explain why Sumerian kings claimed descent from gods, why certain bloodlines were considered sacred, why temple priests underwent rituals described as receiving the divine knowledge, as if accessing inherited capacity rather than learned skill. The Sumerians might have understood themselves as carrying genetic inheritance from species that no longer existed in pure form. But all three explanations, extinction, withdrawal, assimilation, assume these species left because of natural or voluntary processes. There's a fourth possibility, darker and less easily dismissed: deliberate erasure. The flood narratives aren't framed as natural disasters. They're framed as intentional acts. Enlil decides to destroy the world. The gods vote to send the waters. Only Enki's disobedience warning Ziusudra to build the boat allows any survival at all. The texts describe this as culling, as judgment, as divine decision to end what existed and begin anew. What if the flood myths preserve memory of something more troubling than natural catastrophe? What if they record a deliberate extinction event, one species making the decision to erase others, to flood the valleys where non-human populations dwelt, to ensure that only one form of intelligence survived to rebuild? The texts hint at conflict. The Ijiji rebel before humans are created. Pre-flood rulers wage wars described in fragmentary tablets now lost. The Epic of Creation, Enuma Elish, describes cosmic battles between older and younger generations of gods, with Marduk slaughtering Tiamat and creating the world from her corpse. Violence saturates these narratives, framed as divine but described with physical specificity. Blood spilled, bodies dismembered, populations destroyed. If multiple intelligent species coexisted in pre-flood Mesopotamia, resource competition would have been inevitable. Conflicts over territory, water, food could have escalated. Perhaps the flood, whether natural disaster or deliberate act, became the final solution to multi-species tension, ending in the dominance of one, us. The Sumerians inherited the world that followed. They recorded what they remembered, the beings who taught them, the rulers who preceded them, the sages who emerged from the sea. They carved non-human forms into stone, preserved ancient measurements, attributed their knowledge to those who came before. But they also recorded the silence after the flood, the absence, the loss of diversity that once defined the world. One fragment from Uruk, badly damaged, contains a haunting phrase. When the waters receded, we searched for the teachers. We called to the sky and the depths, but none answered, only wind and silence. So we built with what they left us and tried to remember. Modern archaeology may never find definitive proof. Bodies decompose. Bones dissolve in flood sediment. Genetic traces, if they existed, would be scattered beyond recognition in modern populations. The deepest architectural layers sit beneath water tables, unstable and inaccessible. The oldest tablets are fragmentary, their complete context lost. But the Sumerians left us their testimony. In thousands of tablets, hundreds of reliefs, dozens of king lists and creation myths, they documented a world more complex than ours, a world where multiple forms of intelligence coexisted, where humans learned from teachers who didn't share their anatomy, where the species who invented writing used it to preserve memory of species who came before. If the Sumerians remembered species older than us, why does every trace of them seem deliberately erased? Perhaps because remembering is dangerous. Perhaps because acknowledging predecessors undermines the story we tell ourselves about human primacy, about our place as Earth's first and only intelligent inhabitants. Perhaps because the alternative, that we rose not through unique innovation but through inheritance and survival, that we claimed a world shaped by others, that we are simply the species that remained after catastrophe erased the rest, feels too unsettling to accept. The wind still moves over Uruk's ruins, carrying sand that was once brick, once tablet, once the pressed fingerprint of a scribe who lived 5,000 years ago. Beneath that sand, beneath the flood layers, beneath the foundations we can excavate, lie older layers, still layers we may never reach, holding evidence we may never find. But the Sumerians saw those layers. They inherited what survived. And they wrote it down, knowing we might one day read and wonder. Maybe humans were not the first. Maybe we are simply the first who forgot.